So let's start off the video by pissing off the most amount of people possible. And the first famous album that I want to talk about here that uses a drum machine is Bathory's Hammerheart. Now let me just first off say that I actually do not have a problem at all with drum programming or drum machines, MIDI drums, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, you have a computer or a machine playing the drums for a human, right? And I'm not here to snitch on these albums or artists for using them, rather to open your mind and to realize that drum programming, MIDI drums, and things like that have been going on for a very, very long time in metal, and that hating on them is just kind of silly in my opinion. And maybe it'll inspire some of you guys to release your music that has just been sitting rotting on your hard drives, waiting on the local drummer who is in 10 other bands to get back to, release it. Yeah, use the drum program. However, there's a caveat here. If the drums are programmed poorly or if the sounds are terrible, I find it can really take me out of enjoying an album, as all I begin to focus on is the terrible drum sound. And let's be honest here, right? The sound of the drums is one of, if not the most important factors in the overall sound of a metal album. And here on Bathory's Hammerheart, I actually think that the very stiff sound of the drum machine sounds great. Maybe it's just the way it's mixed or the composition of the songs, the atmosphere, but I do think that these drums sound pretty damn good for programmed drums, especially in 1990, 36 years ago. This album is just very atmospheric, and this Viking metal thing, it just really all locks it all together. Now, regardless, the drumming of both Hammerheart and the follow-up album, Twilight of the Gods, sounds leagues better than the drumming, or I guess drum machining, done on Bloodfire Death, which is the 1988 Bathory album. Now, I know a lot of people love this album, but I think the drums here sound like complete shit, and it really makes it hard to listen to this album.
All right, boys, just doing some editing here. I just wanted to make sure that I was correct when talking about Bloodfire Death here, because I know a lot of people love that album, but it definitely seems like a drum machine is used on some songs, not on all of them. Songs like A Fine Day to Die and the title track itself do sound like they have a real drummer, but on a song like Pace Till Death, is 100% a drum machine, and I'm going to tell you guys exactly why. They use the exact same sounds that Gene Hoglan and Chuck Schuldiner would actually use on the Symbolic demos. Here, check it out. So yeah, they're pretty much the exact same sound, same snare. So I'm certain they would use a drum machine on some of the songs here, but probably not all of them.
And I know a lot of people really, really like this album, and I can see why, right? For 1988, this was a pretty crazy release to listen to, I'm sure, but I just can't do it. I'll turn in my metal cred card here. You can take it. Just take it. Take it away from me here. But, Hammerheart and the albums after that sound way better. And we must also just not forget that Korthon's father was the president of a Swedish record label, so it is likely that he had access to all these different drum machines very early on. And regardless, we may never actually know whether or not this is a drum machine, because the whole Bathory thing is just surrounded in mystery, and people will rage and seethe over it until time ceases. But to me, this is definitely a drum machine album, those three as well. Next up, we have a very infamous, or maybe actually just famous, release with a drum machine, and that would be the first Necrophagist album, Onset of Putrefaction. So, well, hello, my friends. We meet again. It has been a while. Where should we begin? Now, I'm making this video because I'm always curious about metal production techniques and drum sounds. I used to be a drummer back in the day, so cymbals, drums, triggers, MIDI programming, right? It's all been an interest of mine. Now, if you're confused with the sound of that clip I just showed you of the Necrophagist album, that's because it is an original version of Onset from 1999, which was using an actual drum machine, which I don't ever think it was confirmed, but it was likely a Boss DR660. However, 5 years later, with a real drummer, Hannes Grossman, Mohamed Sweetchamez would redo all the drums on that album, featuring much higher quality samples, which were recorded by Hannes himself, which sound just so much better. And right, you can find the original version of Onset here on YouTube, but it's one of those rare instances where an artist will go back and change something on a release of theirs, and I like it actually better. That doesn't always happen in the original, right? Most of the times I prefer the original, but here, right, in contrast to the Bathory stuff, where Onset's very inhuman precision actually kind of works well, right? I love the drums here on the redone version. Just all works so well together. It actually makes the whole album sound like a scalpel, right? It's so precise. Now, another album which originally had programmed drums, which was then redone with real drums later on, was the first Theocracy record. Now, the first release of this album, you know, it was all programmed drums, and honestly, it sounded, well, you know, it sounded just okay, honestly. Luckily, like, the strength of the songs and great melodies was good enough to hook me in, and I love this album, but, you know, because of the songs were so good, I could ignore the poor drum sound and inhuman performance, right? However, they would re-record the drums, this time not programmed at all, but a real drummer would play them, and the album is greatly, greatly improved as a result. Okay, so now we have gone through a few examples of arguments of real versus programmed drums and whether ones are better or not, and what albums where the programmed drums, you know, just sound so good. What about examples of programmed drums that sound so good that nobody really notices? Sticking with power metal for a second, the album here is Rhapsody of Fire's Dawn of Victory. Now, power metal is one of those genres in metal where I feel like you can more easily get away with programmed drums. Death metal, progressive metal, right? The drumming is so technical and precise that it's hard. But in power metal, by necessity, the drumming is very standard and straightforward, as the focus is much more usually centered around the vocals and melodies and choruses and such, right? So the drums can kind of play a back seat. And honestly, to me, boys, I had no idea this album had even programmed drums until making this video. The drums just sound fantastic, nice simple arrangements, great simple fills with good solid drum samples, and they avoid a lot of pitfalls, which I find sort of reveals the mirage, so to speak, right? These sort of being big long snare and tom rolls, you know, that's where you can really hear programmed drums a lot of the time, so they don't program the velocities right. Actually, all Rhapsody of Fire albums until Enchanted Lands 2 used programmed drums. And honestly, good for them, right? You know, but drumming recording is hard. It's difficult to get good sounds. And oftentimes the drummer is doing the programming themselves, right? So I totally understand having programmed drums, as drums are like by far the hardest thing to record, and you don't want to fuck up a good sound, right? You just really need a good drum sound, and, you know, and going and recording a real drummer can be a ton of time, a ton of hassle, and maybe most importantly, a ton of money too. So I totally get why bands would use programmed drums. Even back then in like the late 90s, early 2000s. All of these bands that I mentioned will have drummers for live events besides Bathory, you guys get it. And often the drummer is the one doing the programming themselves. In the 90s, using programmed drums and getting them to sound good was a great challenge, right? It was tough. Some bands manage it. But here in the Kali Yuga, I mean the 2020s, you can easily make programmed drums sound just fantastic and human as well if you're really good at programming them. Now, speaking of more recent albums with programmed drums, which I know, you know, there are probably like thousands of records out there, so please list your favorites down below. And while you're at it, why not hit that subscribe button? Really appreciate it. Hit that like too. I also have a membership here on YouTube if you want to support your boy financially with some dollar bills, dollary dues, appreciate it. Fulci's 2019 release, Tropical Sun, features excellent use of programmed drums as well here. Now, these drums are programmed to be very, very simple and straightforward, which often is like the best way to go, but not too simple that it sounds robotic or that it's being looped, but simple enough that you just don't notice, right? Again, the fills are where you notice the drum programming a lot. And the drums really help to sell the whole package. I very much enjoy this Italian old school death metal release. And later releases would actually see them use a real drummer, which I think is sort of like the typical pattern after a band gets some success and more support. All right, next up we have Meshuggah's Catch 33, which I'm sure some of you have just been screaming at me the whole time to bring up here. This album is basically one continuous suite of music with 13 different sections, and it's just great. Really great album to like work to, just sort of entrances you. This album came out in 2005 and was one of like the first big notable albums to sort of openly feature programmed drums using Easy Drummer's Drum Kit from Hell expansion, of which drummer Thomas played a large part in developing. I think what makes this example of programmed drums interesting is that in a sort of weird, ironic twist, this is one of Meshuggah's least complex and least crazy rhythmically, you know, at least in relative terms. It still is Meshuggah after all, albums in terms of drums, right? So it's just kind of funny, right, that the really hard albums, Thomas just plays the drums live. And here on Catch 33, where it's a little bit easier, they just programmed it. You know, I mean, you can't even really tell. The drums sound fantastic here. And right, Drum Kit from Hell, you know, Easy Drummer, Superior Drummer, they would become like huge, massive successes, which probably like tens of thousands of records using them at this point, or demos or stuff like that, right? And so I almost sort of view Catch 33 as like a proof of concept for Easy Drummer, right? Like you can make a great sounding, enjoyable album with sampled drums, and this was sort of their proof of concept, you know what I mean? You know, it just sounds just as good as if the guy played it himself, so it just works out well. Spiritbox is another band which, due to economic realities, and let's be honest, right, the ease of not having to battle drummer schedules, you know, trying to get a band together, right? Spiritbox relied heavily on programmed drums all throughout their career up until only very recently. Songwriter Mike Stringer would write guitar parts, drums, bass all together and then hand it off to the singer for vocals, and that's how their workflow was for a while. Now I'm going to assume that they would have been using maybe Superior Drummer 3, maybe a Get Good Drums library, and I have to say that I think the drums on Spiritbox albums, their records, have always sounded great, especially on Eternal Blue. And if you can learn how to program MIDI drums and not just max 127 velocity every single hit, you can get a really great dynamic performance. And a lot of drum VSTs or even DAWs have sort of humanizing features, right? A good example of this is their song Constance, just great stuff, great drum programming in that. Typo Negative would be another band which would use drum programming, although the debate is still out there. But to me, it really seems like at least their 3-album run from October Rust forward used drum machines. And honestly, fits the music, right? The focus was not on the drums at all here in their very gothic metal sound, right? It's obviously on Peter Steele's crooning vocals and these sort of grand, melancholic, romantic melodies, I guess you could say, you know what I mean? So Typo Negative is another band which would use programmed drums or MIDI drums or drum machines, whatever they were using in the mid-90s. I don't know, I was 2 years old when that one came out. And then, of course, we have Judas Priest's 1988 album, Ram It Down. It would also feature very heavy usage of drum machines. The sounds of these also vary quite a bit in sound here on the album. You know, maybe they used a few different drum machines or they recorded different spots, different studios, whatever. You know, the drums on Blood Red Skies sound way different than on Ram It Down or even Heavy Metal. And I think there are even a few songs here where real drums were played here as well. I know there's a technique where they'll have the drum machines play the snare and kick, and then the drummer might play real cymbals too. And then the drummer play real cymbals as well. Not sure if that was used here. You know, it's all kind of shrouded at mystery. I think this album is very influenced by Def Leppard's Hysteria. That album had a very, very sort of big, bombastic electronic drum sound. So maybe that's what they're trying to emulate here. It worked out pretty well. I like this album, but ultimately Judas Priest's short stunt with a drum machine would end quickly when Travis Richter would join the band and lay down one of the best drum performances of all time on the follow-up album, Painkiller. So yeah, what are your thoughts on drum programming, drum machines, guys? Leave them down below. Cheers.